The first sign that something was wrong came from a message that wasn't meant for me. I still remember the exact moment. It was early morning, just after sunrise. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Daniel breathing beside me. My husband had always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of person who could sleep through thunderstorms. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't look. Daniel and I had been married for almost 9 years, and we trusted each other. At least, that's what I believed. But that morning, the screen lit up just enough for me to see the message preview. 3 simple words. Are you coming tonight? No name. Just a number. My stomach tightened instantly. I stared at the phone for a moment, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. Maybe it was work. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was even a wrong number. But deep down, something felt wrong. Because Daniel had been acting different lately. Not in a dramatic way. Not the kind of change you immediately notice. It was subtle, slow, almost invisible at first. But once you started paying attention, you couldn't stop noticing. It began with the late nights. Daniel worked in marketing for a tech company, and deadlines were normal. I understood that. Sometimes projects ran late. Sometimes meetings went long. But the late nights started happening more often. At first once a week. Then twice. Then almost every night. When I asked him about it, he always had an explanation ready. Big campaign coming up. Last-minute revisions. Client meeting ran long. Each reason sounded reasonable. But something about the way he said them felt rehearsed. Then came the phone. Daniel had never cared much about privacy before. His phone was always lying around the house. Kitchen counter. Coffee table. Bathroom sink. But suddenly it was always in his pocket. Always face down. Always locked. One evening I casually picked it up just to check the time. Locked. That alone felt strange. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "Security update." Security update. That was it. But what really shook me happened a few nights later. Daniel came home late again, around 11 p.m. I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch television, but in reality I had been staring at the same scene for almost 20 minutes. When he walked in, he leaned down and kissed my forehead like he always did. And that's when I smelled it. Perfume. Soft. Floral. Sweet. Definitely not mine. For a moment my mind went completely blank. I pulled back slightly, trying to keep my voice calm. Long day? He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. You have no idea. Then he went straight upstairs to shower. I sat there on the couch, staring at the dark television screen. Every possible explanation ran through my mind. Maybe he sat next to someone wearing perfume. Maybe someone hugged him goodbye. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But the thought I couldn't escape was the one I feared the most. Another woman. Over the next 2 weeks, the feeling grew stronger. Daniel became more distant. Not cold exactly. Just distracted. Sometimes I would catch him staring at his phone with a small smile before quickly locking the screen. Sometimes he would step outside to take calls. Sometimes he would leave the room entirely. Every small thing began to feel suspicious. And once suspicion takes root, it grows fast. One night I woke up around 2 in the morning. Daniel wasn't in bed. I walked downstairs quietly. The living room light was on. He was sitting on the couch, whispering into his phone. When he noticed me, he immediately ended the call. "Work stuff," he said quickly. But his face looked pale. And his voice sounded nervous. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped. I needed to know the truth. A few days later, Daniel told me he had another late meeting. "Probably won't be home until midnight," he said while grabbing his keys. I nodded casually. Okay. But the moment his car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my jacket and followed him. My hands were shaking as I drove. Part of me hoped I was wrong. That I was being paranoid. That I would follow him to his office and feel ridiculous. But Daniel didn't drive toward his office. He drove downtown. Then into a quieter neighborhood filled with older apartment buildings. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of a small, worn-down complex. My heart sank. I parked across the street and watched. Daniel stepped out of his car and walked toward the entrance like he had done it many times before. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Like he knew exactly where he was going. I sat there frozen for almost 5 minutes. This was it. Inside that building was probably the woman he had been seeing. The one sending messages. The one wearing that perfume. The one slowly replacing me. My chest felt tight as I got out of the car. Every step toward the building felt heavier than the last. Inside, the hallway smelled like old carpet and cleaning chemicals. I quietly followed the direction I had seen Daniel walk. He stopped at apartment 3B. I stood outside the door, my heart pounding. I could hear voices inside. Daniel's voice. And another voice. A man's voice. That confused me. But before I could process it, the door opened. Standing in front of me was an older man. Maybe in his late 50s. Gray hair. Tired eyes. But something about his face looked familiar. He studied me for a moment. Then his eyes widened slightly. "You must be Emily," he said. I froze. "How do you know my name?" Before he could answer, Daniel appeared behind him in the hallway. And the moment he saw me, his face turned completely pale. "Emily, what are you doing here?" My voice shook. "I should be asking you that." Silence filled the hallway. The older man sighed quietly. Then he said something that made my entire world stop. "Daniel never told you about me, did he?" I looked at him, confused. "Told me what?" The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm his father." I laughed automatically. That's impossible. Daniel's father had died when he was 12. I had heard the story many times. But Daniel wasn't laughing. He looked like someone had just exposed his deepest secret. Finally he spoke. "The man who raised me wasn't my real father." The words hung in the air. My mind struggled to catch up. "What are you talking about?" Daniel ran his hand through his hair, clearly overwhelmed. A few months ago I took one of those DNA tests online. Just for fun. He swallowed. But the results didn't match what I expected. Instead of matching the family he knew, the test connected him to this man. Robert. His biological father. Apparently Daniel's mother had kept the truth hidden his entire life. Robert hadn't even known Daniel existed. Until the DNA results connected them. For the past few weeks, Daniel had been meeting him. Talking. Learning about a life he never knew he had. A father he never knew existed. That's why he had been coming here. That's why he had been taking secret calls. That's why he had been acting distant. Not because of another woman, but because his entire identity had been shaken. I leaned against the wall, trying to process everything. Then suddenly another question popped into my head. The perfume. Daniel frowned. What perfume? Robert chuckled softly. My wife's, he said. She hugs everyone goodbye. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension leave my chest. I had been so sure Daniel was cheating. So convinced our marriage was falling apart. But the truth had been something completely different. And somehow, even more complicated. Over the next few months, Daniel slowly built a relationship with Robert. They talked about the past. About family history. About everything Daniel had missed growing up. It wasn't easy. Learning that your entire family story isn't what you believed can shake a person deeply. Some nights Daniel sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring into space. I don't even know who I am anymore, he admitted once. But slowly, things began to heal. Robert introduced him to the rest of the family. A wife. 2 daughters. People who welcomed Daniel with open arms. And I watched my husband slowly rebuild a part of himself he never knew was missing. One evening we sat in the backyard together under the old apple tree behind our house. Daniel looked at me and smiled. You know what's crazy? What? If you hadn't followed me that night, you'd probably still think I was cheating. I laughed. Don't remind me. He squeezed my hand. Thank you for trusting me enough to look for the truth. And in that moment I realized something important. Sometimes the truth isn't what destroys a relationship. Sometimes the truth is what saves it. Even if it arrives in the most unexpected way possible.